People have various misconceptions about what the church is. In my time as a pastor and as a pastor's son, I've experienced a lot of the different misconceptions that people have. Let me give you like the top 2 misconceptions people have about church. The first one is that the church exists just to take your money. That's all that the church is. It's going after your wallet. Martha, grab your purse. Here comes the preacher. He's going to talk about the offering. And that's why the church is there, to just take your money and do whatever they do with it, build their buildings, do their stuff. But that's what the church is all about. And people aren't really much more than just their checkbook. The second misconception is that the church exists to have a bunch of rules and a bunch of regulations in order to manipulate and control people. And maybe there was some truth back there 2,000 years ago, but the powers that be and society at large has taken over the church, and now the church is just a bunch of rules and regulations to manipulate and control me. I've found that those 2 misconceptions are prevalent today outside of the church and within the church. Maybe you've thought of them yourself. And I can see, and can't you see how people could think that? You can turn on the TV, you can see the preacher on television asking the little old lady for a Social Security check so he can fly in his jet around the world, and you understand that. Some churches are known more for what they're against than what they're for, and it's all about following the rules of that group, that organization. And maybe you've been a part of a church that was very legalistic, and you didn't feel accepted or appreciated unless you fell in the line and you did the things that you were supposed to do, and you didn't do the things that you weren't supposed to do. So I get it. But why does the church exist? Why does the church even exist? Well, Village Bible Church and the church at large exists to make disciples of all the nations, to glorify God, to give God his rightful place as King of heaven and earth, creator of all there is. And that's why we exist. We have the 3 Ds of discipleship at Village. We talk about discovering disciples, developing disciples, and deploying disciples. All of that is part of our mission. We exist to give God glory. And we actually don't exist to get people into heaven, although that's a secondary thing that happens, but we exist to get more people into a right relationship with God so they can know God and experience him and know the one that made them. It's manufacturer's specifications for you. You will never know peace. You will never know joy. You will never know significance until you know the one who made you. But there's a problem. Sin exists in the world. And there wasn't always sin. Back in the Garden of Eden, things were heavenly. It was heaven. It was heaven on earth. Listen to what God tells Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 1, verses 28 and following. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. In the garden, Adam and Eve had significance. They were given this mandate by God to steward creation, yes, but to be fruitful and multiply and to have dominion and to build families and to build cities and to have crops. And they had significance. They were the crown of God's creation. They also had peace. There was no sin. There were no nations fighting one another. They had prosperity. Everything that they did prospered. Sin was not part of the equation. Just imagine that. They also had eternal life. Why did they have all of these things? They had it all because they had a relationship with God. They walked with God. They talked with God. He was there, right there with them. This is an amazing thing. But then, a couple chapters later, Genesis chapter 3, sin comes into the world. They disobey God. They rebel against God. And they break the relationship that they had with him. And so now they had sin. And because of that sin, now they had shame. They knew that they were naked. And it wasn't just that they were naked physically, although they were naked before God with their sin. They had sinned against God. They had disobeyed, and so they hid from God as he came back to the garden. So they had sin and shame, which led to separation from God, and then death entered into creation. So we have this problem of sin and death and separation. But the gospel is good news. And this is the good news, that God wasn't just done with mankind and done with creation because of sin, but he made a way for sin to be forgiven. And that's through his son, Jesus, through the Messiah. Jesus came into the world, and he went to the cross to bear your sin and your shame and to take away the separation that you experience from God because of your sin on the cross. And he died a perfect death for you as the sacrificial Lamb of God, so that if you would believe in him, you would not perish, but you would have everlasting life. And now, because of faith in him, because of what the Messiah has done, you don't have sin and shame and separation and death. No, you are restored to the right relationship with God. You are significant. You do have peace. You do have prosperity. And you have the promise of eternal life. This is the good news. And the good news is not only that you experience those things, which you do. The good news is you have God, who is the creator of those things. That's what the good news is. So now you can leave this place forgiven, knowing God, not having to worry about working hard enough to do good enough so that at the end of your life, the good will outweigh the bad, and hopefully God will accept me for who I am as I stand before his judgment. No, you're forgiven because of Jesus, because of the Messiah. This is the good news that we preach and we proclaim at Village Bible Church. Now, I want to be careful that I don't do this in a way that uses fear to coerce people into an emotional decision to get maybe one of the secondary benefits of God himself. God is the benefit. It's knowing who created you. But I could use fear to coerce a decision. Let me give you an example. My kids, when they were little, especially, we'd tuck them in every night. Not so much anymore, but we'd talk to them about their day and how spiritual things, and we'd pray for them and stuff like that. And I remember thinking I could really easily coerce them into asking Jesus into their heart. And I could say, well, you know, you're a sinner. I'm a sinner. You're a sinner. And you're going to have to answer to God for your sin. You're going to stand before God one day. You're going to have to give an account for your life. And you're going to have sin, and that sin, those wages of those sins will lead to death, and God will judge you, and you will be separated from him forever in a place called hell. Now, you can go to heaven, which is an awesome place, a wonderful place, a place where mom and dad are going to be, a place where grandma and grandpa are going to be, and you can go there if you ask Jesus to come into your heart. Now, all those things that I said were true, right? But I'm using fear to coerce some type of a ask Jesus into my heart moment, and then my child would grow up thinking, well, yeah, sure, I'm a Christian. I asked Jesus to come into my heart, when they were actually only responding to a secondary part of the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. They were responding to the emotional response of heaven and hell. And they didn't really know anything about God or Jesus or Christ. Now, God in his mercy, he can save you in that moment, right? Maybe some of you remember that. But now you've grown as a Christian. You've learned that it's not just about getting out of hell, right? That's not just the good news. It's a benefit of it, but that's not just why we are here gathered. We are here to know God and to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. And it is knowing God that you experience eternal life. So I don't want to use fear to coerce you to respond to something that really isn't even the gospel. But fear is used in the scriptures to help us have a right relationship with God. And that's what I want to show you today from Hebrews chapter 4. So if you got your Bibles, go to Hebrews chapter 4. We're going to be in verses 1 through 11. And I want you to take special note of how he uses, or she, we don't know who wrote it, this idea of fear of God to help us. Hebrews chapter 4. Therefore, while the promise of entering the rest still stands, let us fear, lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them, but the message that they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united by faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter that rest, as he had said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Although his works were finished from the foundation of the world, for he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this passage he said, they shall not enter my rest. Since therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience, again he appoints a certain day, today, saying through David so long afterward, in the words already quoted, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would have not spoken of another day later on. So then, there remains the Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works, as God did from his. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. So let me give you two observations and then three main points that will go pretty fast, okay? The first observation, as I read this, is that there's a promise of rest for God's people. We see this all throughout these verses. There's a promise of rest for the people of God. If you're a Christian, this is for you. It's a promise for you. It's a promise of rest. It was a promise for the nation of Israel. They had a promise of rest first in the promised land, the land of Canaan. That's the whole backdrop of what his argument has been from chapter 1. The nation of Israel is an example to us, and they had a promise of rest in the land of Canaan. That's where they were going to. That's where they were headed, from slavery in Egypt to the promised land. There's a promise of rest. But he also talks about a different rest, because he says in verse 8, Joshua led them into the promised land, but if it was just that, then they would be done. They would have arrived. But there's another rest. It's a Sabbath rest, he calls it. The rest that God had after he created the earth in 6 days, then he rested on the seventh day. There was a rest from work. That's a promise that God has for his people as well. There's a rest coming, a rest that is yet to come. Now there is a rest for us in the present day. That's the rest of salvation. The author is also alluding to that we have rest when you experience the forgiveness that only Jesus can give you. There's a rest from your work and your toil. Do you remember what it was like to try to work to get God to accept you? That's tiring. There's a rest in Jesus Christ where you can be justified by his work on the cross, and you can rest in that fact. That's what we sang about. But there is also then a final rest, a heavenly home, a rest that is even yet to come that's here too, a promise for you and for me. That's the promise of heaven. And so if I was to die right here in front of you right now, which could happen, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, but if I was to drop dead, it'd be uncomfortable for you all, but not for me, right? My body would be here, but my soul, my spirit, my conscience would go to be with Jesus, to be absent from the bodies, to be in the presence of the Lord, Paul says. And so I would go immediately to heaven. That's heaven right now, with Jesus right now, with all those believers who have gone before me. And I'd be fine. I'd be great. I'd be in a place that's better in a lot of ways than here because I'm with Jesus. I'm with my Creator God. That's the promise of heaven, but that's the intermediate heaven. Not purgatory, but just the intermediate heaven. It's the heaven right now. But there is coming a day where Jesus is coming back as ruler and king of the universe, not as a little baby anymore to go to the cross. He comes back as the conquering king, and he brings with him all those who have died and are with him already. And so if that's me, I'm coming back. And you all who are still alive, you as believers in Jesus Christ, as Christians, you would be supernaturally transformed into resurrection bodies as well. You would have the same type of body that Jesus had when he rose from the dead. And I would receive my body back, but it would be the supernatural body. It would be the resurrected body. And then we are to live with him forever in the new heavens and the new earth. You can read about it at the end of the book, Revelation. And that's the plan that's yet to come. That's a rest. That's a hope. That's the hope of glory. When the scriptures say the hope of glory, it's not, I hope so someday. It's like, it's our hope that we're hanging on to. That's what they mean by the hope of glory and the hope of heaven. So we have a rest that's coming for us as God's people, which is awesome. That's the first observation. Now, the second observation is that fear can help us get to that rest. Fear can help us get to that rest. You see verse 1, it says, while the promise of entering that rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. Now, the promise of entering this rest remains open. It will not be reached automatically, so you would do well to fear the possibility of missing it. Just as the generation of Israelites died in the wilderness, in the same way, and they missed out the promise, rest, the promised land. In the same way, be fearful that you won't die in the wilderness and fail to reach that rest. Their bodies were strewn across the wilderness, never getting to the place that God had planned for them. You do well, Christian, to fear not making it to the rest. So let's try to get a balance on this fear that is good to have, that this passage is talking about, okay? Because fear, and this is the big idea of the message today, fear can be a good thing, especially when it helps us attain our goals. And in this instant, the goal is God. The goal is to strive to enter that rest. Verse 11, let us strive, therefore, to get there. So fear can be a motivating factor for us. It can help us to get there. And it's not so foreign to us. We use fear all the time. We use fear in raising our kids. I mean, my kids are, I think, past the age of being really little. They're getting older now, so when they were really little, when they first were born, I had one goal in raising my kids. I don't know about you, but my one goal was just to keep them alive, okay? Just to keep them alive, and it almost didn't happen one day. I had this little snowblower that I got, and it was a plug-in one. Had a roller brush that just would brush an inch or two of snow max, so we got an inch of snow one day, and I brought Trey out. He was 2 years old at the time, and I started using it, and it was working. It was throwing the snow, and then there was a rock underneath, and the rock kicked and threw it right at Trey and hit him right in the throat. And it was scary. It was a scary moment. He was fine. He's got 2 Adam's apples now, but he's fine. He made it through. And but my one goal is to keep my kids alive. And you know what? We use fear in that. When we talked about the road or the street. And you take your kids and you go up to the road, and what do you tell them to do? Make sure you look both ways, because you got to be careful. There's people coming and they're driving crazy and fast, and they might not see you, and you're going to be toast if you go out on the road, right? And so there's a fear of the road that is a healthy fear for them to have. So you use that. Proverbs 1:7 says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. See, when you have the right foundation, when you know who God is, when you fear God, that's where you begin to grow in your wisdom and you begin to grow in knowledge. Here the fear is that fear that you don't make it. Fear that you don't make it to your rest. That's our goal, to strive to enter into that rest. So let me give you three points that I see here. Number 1, fear so that you don't follow the crowd. Fear so that you don't follow the crowd. Now look at verse 2. For good news came to us just as to them. But the message did not benefit them because they're not united by faith with those who listened. This gospel here, good news, came to us. It came to the Christians here that he's writing to in Hebrews, these Hebrew Christians. He says the good news came to the nation of Israel too. It came to them. Now, they didn't have it all worked out. They didn't have the name of the Messiah, Jesus. They didn't know when exactly he was going to be born. The prophets hadn't exactly expounded all of it. We get to look back and we have it all laid out for us. It's a great time to be alive. But they still were promised good news by God. One of the places that you see this is in Exodus. Exodus chapter 19. Moses goes up to God, and the Lord calls him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." There's the good news. There's the promise of God, that Israel was going to be his people, that they were going to be the light in the world for God. They were going to show the way to God. They would be his people. He would be their God. And so they received that promise. Now think of it. A whole generation of these people who received the promise did not make it. They didn't. They heard the good news, but they didn't have faith in it. You see, it was not united by faith. It's not the hearing of the gospel by itself that brings final salvation, but it's the appropriation of it by faith. You know, that's what people say, the difference, missing heaven by 18 inches, and the head and the heart, right? If the head just acknowledges it, it's true, it could be true, it's historical. Jesus really was a man who died at the hands of the Romans. That's an acknowledgement of it being true, but the heart believes it for yourself. That's faith. Faith is believing that for you. It's not just out there somewhere having happened and it's true. It's believing it. It's the faith that you have in the truth of the message. It's not just giving assent to the truth of an event. These people that were out there, they didn't have faith. The Israelites, just think of that. They were the people that were witnesses to the plagues coming down on Egypt. They were walking through on dry ground in the Red Sea. They were the ones that God was providing food for out in the wilderness and water miraculously, taking care of them. And yet they didn't believe it. And they wanted all the time to go back to Egypt. That was the crowd. The crowd was a generation that didn't make it. That was the crowd. You remember the crowd. They got all fired up when Moses was up on Sinai too long, meeting with God. And he's like, Aaron, we need to have another leader here. We need to have another poster God for ourselves to follow. So let's make a golden calf. You remember that? That's the generation. They didn't believe. They didn't have faith. That was the crowd. Now, high school, I think, is one of the most times I think, and maybe you disagree with me, but that you feel the pressure of the crowd, right? Because your life is really exposed with all these other kids, and you're doing life with them more than any other time. You go to college, if you go to college, and you're kind of getting your own cliques and your own groups, and then you get out, and maybe you get married, or you go to a job, and you do have pressure, but it's not as intense as the high school bubble, right? Remember that? And there's the, drink this or smoke this, or you better have sex with your boyfriend or girlfriend, or you better talk like this. It's all those things that are swirling around the pressure of the crowd. And here's the thing. If everybody's doing it, that's a bad thing. Be afraid. Be fearful, because the crowd almost never goes God's way. The crowd goes the opposite way. Jesus said it this way. He said, "Wide is the road that leads to destruction. Many people are on that road. Narrow is the road that leads to life, and few find it." Fear, so that you don't follow the crowd. The second thing that we should fear is to fear so that you don't fall into disobedience. So these people who were part of the crowd, they disobeyed God. Verse 6. They received the good news. Remember, they didn't believe it by faith, but they received it, and they failed to enter because of disobedience. Now, what's this a reference to? Well, this crowd that wasn't satisfied with God in the nation of Israel, they weren't satisfied with Moses. Remember, they complained about food. God gave them manna. They got sick of the manna. He gave them meat. He gave them quail. They were sick of Moses and his leadership. And they remembered fondly the days of Egypt. Let's go back to Egypt. That was great. They forgot that they were slaves, but let's go back to Egypt. They had better food, they had better movies, and better culture, better cars. So they rejected and they disobeyed. And specifically, not only did they grumble and murmur against God, is the word that used in the Old Testament. It's onomatopoeia in Pia. Onomatopoeia. I don't even know. I can't remember. Yes, something like that. But anyway, it's a word that sounds like what it is. And so it's like murmuring in Hebrew, murmur. They're just grumbling, complaining against God. And God brings them right to the promised land pretty quick. They're not wandering around the wilderness. He brings them there pretty quick in Numbers 14. And here's their response. When the spies have come back from the land, they're just on the border. Here's the promised land. Here's the land of rest. Here's the land of Canaan. The 12 spies go in there. And they're like reporting, these people are strong people. They got some strong towns, strong cities. We better be careful. But there's other 2 spies that, hey, this is great. This is what God has promised us. It's a beautiful land. It's got land flowing with milk and honey and all the stuff, right? So they're there, ready to go in the promised land. God's commanding them to go in there. And they respond, and all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to one another, "Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt." The crowd disobeyed God, and they would go back to the wilderness where they would die. So fear so that you don't fall into disobedience. When you follow the crowd, you fall into disobedience. And when you fall into disobedience, you fail to reach God's rest. So that's number 3. Fear so that you don't fail to reach that rest. There's a lot of people that start strong. There's a lot of people that confess Jesus as Lord. But there's fewer that make it to the end. And you say, "Pastor Stephen, don't we have eternal security? Isn't our salvation secure in God?" I mean, yeah, absolutely. But I also know this is here for a reason. And I don't see him giving any caveats in chapter 4. Like, this isn't really true, so don't worry about it. No, he's preaching. This is a sermon. The whole book is. He's preaching this to be fearful so that the fear would spur you to a closer relationship to God. And that fear would help direct you as you go about your life. Now, the rest of these verses, they're kind of complicated in the way that he talks about this rest. But he talks about creation. There's the rest, the seventh day creation. Then he talks about the nation of Israel. Some of them didn't make it to the promised land. Then he talks about David in the Psalms. And he writes, today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart. Today, you can enter into God's rest, my rest. The whole point of what he's saying here is that God's rest was available all throughout history to the people who would receive it. To the people that knew God, the rest is still available. And today is still the same. God's rest is still available. Strive to get there. Strive to get to him. Strive to make it. His rest is available to you today. But it won't always be available. And that's not fear to coerce you. That's just the truth. Now, it says, let us fear, verse 1, that any of you should not make it. So, as I was reading this, not only is it good for us ourselves to think about our life and where we're at with God, how serious we think that this relationship with God is, or is it just a Sunday morning thing, or is it your life? But it's not only for ourselves. Did you know it's for people around us? Let us fear lest any of you should have seemed to have failed to reach it. My job as a pastor, your job as a Christian, is to be concerned for the people around you, to actually be fearful that they won't make it. And that should help us and spur us on to be an encouragement to those around us, to love those around us, and to help one of those around us to shoulder their responsibility and their burden, and to help them get to the place of rest. And that can be hard because sometimes there's hard conversations that need to happen, right? And they do happen because you love them and you're fearful for them. I had to have a couple of those conversations this past couple weeks, and I don't like confrontation. I really don't. I'd rather just laugh and have fun and enjoy life and enjoy God's peace and blessing and all those things that He gives. But there's times that we need to be concerned for those around us, to fear that the people around us might not make it. Maybe they'd be the ones that die out in the wilderness. And so that helps us to spur us on to help them. Now, you might be thinking, well, are we supposed to live lives of fear as a Christian? I mean, what's he saying here? And I would say no, we're not to live lives of fear, but we are to always have fear as part of our life. Does that make any sense? It doesn't make sense to me. So let me try to unpack that a little bit. So you teach your kids to be fearful of the road, right? And so many times they're in the backyard playing, then they're down at the park playing, and there's no fear of the road for them. They're enjoying life. They're enjoying the park. They're enjoying their yard. But if they get close to the road, then they know to look both ways. Then they know that there's danger. And there's a fear that they always have, but they enjoy most of their life because they're not living life on the road. But when they get close, the fear comes. And that's, I think, the way that we're supposed to live as Christians. It helps us. And if we start living in a way that's following the crowd, that's disobedient, that's not worried about what God thinks, that there would be a red flag that would come up. And it would be a fearful flag and say, hey, snap out of it. Wake up. This is serious business. Christ died for you. He does love you. He does give His life for you, but you are treating Him with disdain in your disobedience. And that would be a fear that would be good. It would be healthy. One of the passages that is so helpful to me with this is from Psalm 34. Because Jesus said to fear, Jesus says, don't fear the one that can destroy the body. Fear the one that can destroy both the body and the soul in hell. Who's that? That's God. Jesus said, fear God. Fear of God is the beginning of knowledge. So Psalm 34, verses 4 through 7, to me, helps capture this balance that we have as Christians. How do we live courageous lives? Because, man, Christians are the most courageous people. They should be. We should be the most courageous people on the planet. We should be. We don't have to fear the most remote jungle on the planet. If we have the gospel of Jesus Christ, we can go in there with courage because God is with us. If God is for us, who can be against us? We have the Lord Jesus Christ and His message. We don't have to fear COVID. We don't have to fear cancer even. We don't have to fear what's going to come in the future. We don't have to fear the future. We have our future set in God. We should be the most courageous people. And yet, we should fear God. Fear should be the parallel boundaries of our life. Psalm 34 says this, I sought the Lord, this is verse 4, I sought the Lord, and He answered me and delivered me from all my fears. God delivers us from our fears. Praise God. Those who look to Him are radiant, and their faces shall never be ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. If this is not a great description of you, I don't know what else is. God delivers you from your fear. God saves you from His love and His passion. He takes you from your troubles. He gives you eternal life. He gives you the peace and prosperity and significance that was lost in the fall. But then verse 7 says, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear Him, and He delivers them. May we, as God's people, enjoy salvation. Enjoy the life that He has given. He has given us all good things, but may we still fear Him in a healthy way that we are to ever get close to the road. We would be afraid because He is God.